An evil cop thought he could steal a black millionaire's luxury car and get away with it. But what he didn't know was that karma was speeding right toward him. In just 10 minutes, his life would take a shocking turn, exposing secrets, lies, and a twist so dramatic you won't believe what happens next. How does justice find him? And what will it cost him in the end? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. 28-year-old black lawyer Jordan Carter prepares for a high-profile corruption trial against Officer Gerald Harbor, a racist 40-year-old white cop. Harbor smirks arrogantly in court. Jordan Carter adjusted his tie one final time in the courthouse bathroom mirror. 10 years of law school and passionate dedication to justice had led him to this day. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he took slow, deliberate breaths. The evidence against Officer Gerald Harbor was overwhelming. Documented instances of brutality, racial profiling, and corruption that had destroyed countless lives in their community. Jordan's hands trembled slightly as he gathered his files, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what lay ahead. Walking into courtroom 3B, Jordan's footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors. The gallery was packed, tension thick in the air. Local media lined the back wall, their cameras ready to capture every moment of this landmark case. Officer Harbor sat at the defense table, his police uniform crisp and decorated with medals that seemed to mock the very justice system they represented. When their eyes met, Harbor's lips curved into a smirk that made Jordan's stomach turn. There was no remorse in those cold eyes, only arrogance and contempt. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Margaret Peterson entered the courtroom. Jordan rose, his shoulders straight, his resolve stronger than ever. As he delivered his opening statement, his voice carried clear and strong through the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Jordan began, his words measured and precise. "Today we will present evidence that Officer Gerald Harbor has systematically abused his power, targeting minority communities with unnecessary force and corrupt practices. This isn't about one incident or one mistake. This is about a pattern of behavior that undermines the very foundation of law enforcement and public trust." Throughout the trial, Jordan methodically presented his case. Body camera footage showed Harbor's excessive force during arrests. Internal Affairs reports detailed complaints that had been buried. Former colleagues testified about racial slurs and targeted harassment. Through it all, Harbor maintained his smirk, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his defense attorney. His confidence seemed to grow with each witness, as if he knew something nobody else did. When the verdict finally came, Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. On the counts of corruption and abuse of power, we find the defendant, Gerald Harbor, guilty, the jury forewoman announced. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Jordan maintained his professional composure, but inside, his heart soared. Finally, justice would be served. But when Judge Peterson delivered the sentence, Jordan's victory turned hollow. "Officer Gerald Harbor, I hereby sentence you to 18 months in county jail, with possibility of parole after 6 months. The air seemed to leave the room. Jordan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the lenient sentence. All those months of preparation, all the evidence of years of systematic abuse, and this was the result? Harbor's smirk widened into a full grin as bailiffs approached to escort him out. As they led him past the prosecution table, he paused, turning to face Jordan. His eyes burned with hatred and promise of vengeance. "You'll pay for this," Harbor growled, his voice low and menacing, before the bailiffs pulled him away. Jordan watched him go, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. The victory felt empty, tainted by the knowledge that the system he'd devoted his life to still had so far to go. The light sentence was a stark reminder that justice wasn't always blind, and that some battles, even when won, left deeper wounds than defeats. Gerald Harbor stood at the prison gates squinting in the harsh morning sunlight. His few belongings fit into a single duffel bag, 18 months of his life reduced to some worn clothes and toiletries. The prison-issued clothes hung loose on his frame, a constant reminder of how much weight he'd lost behind bars. His wife, Susan, hadn't come to pick him up. The divorce papers had arrived 3 months into his sentence, along with a letter explaining she couldn't handle the shame anymore. Their 2 teenage children had stopped visiting after the first month. The taxi ride to his mother's house was silent, the driver occasionally glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Harbor stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of his former beat roll by. Each corner held memories of his time as an officer, memories now tainted by his conviction. His mother's small ranch house looked exactly as he remembered, though the garden had grown wild with weeds. She'd agreed to let him stay until he got back on his feet, but their relationship had grown strained. The disappointment in her eyes cut deeper than any prison sentence. "The spare room is ready," she said quietly, not meeting his gaze as she opened the door. "I made up the bed with fresh sheets." Days turned into weeks as Harbor searched for work. Each application seemed to end the same way. Potential employers would recognize his name from the news coverage of his trial, or the background check would reveal his conviction. Even fast food restaurants turned him away. One evening, sitting in his mother's living room, Harbor watched the local news. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup, the ceramic clinking against his teeth. The story was about a new police reform initiative, and there on the screen was Jordan Carter. The years had been kind to Jordan. He looked distinguished in his expensive suit, speaking confidently about accountability and justice. The caption identified him as a prominent civil rights attorney and community leader. "This reform package," Jordan was saying, "will ensure that what happened 10 years ago with Officer Harbor never happens again. We're building a better system, one that serves everyone equally." Harbor's coffee cup shattered in his grip, hot liquid spilling across his lap. He barely noticed the pain. His mother rushed in from the kitchen, but he waved her away, his eyes fixed on the screen. Jordan continued speaking about transparency and progress, each word stoking the flames of Harbor's resentment. This man had everything: respect, success, influence. Meanwhile, Harbor's own life lay in ruins. His pension was gone, his marriage destroyed, his children wouldn't speak to him, and no one would hire him. Later that night, alone in his room, Harbor pulled out the newspaper clippings he'd collected about Jordan over the years. Articles about his cases, his community work, his rising prominence in legal circles. The younger man's success felt like a personal assault, a mockery of Harbor's downfall. The faces of Jordan Carter stared back at him from various photos, speaking at podiums, shaking hands with politicians, receiving awards. Each image was a reminder of everything Harbor had lost. "He ruined my life," Harbor said, his knuckles white with tension. "Now I'll ruin his." The sleek Tesla Model S glided silently through the evening traffic, its pearl-white finish reflecting the city lights. Jordan Carter adjusted his bow tie in the rearview mirror, a small smile playing on his lips. The designer tuxedo he wore felt worlds away from the hand-me-downs of his childhood. As he drove toward the Metropolitan Convention Center, memories of his early years flooded back. He remembered his mother working double shifts as a nurse's aide, scraping together enough for his law school application fees. The countless nights studying by lamplight in their small apartment, the sound of sirens wailing outside their window in the rougher part of town. "Look at you now, Mom," Jordan whispered, touching the St. Christopher medal she'd given him for graduation. She hadn't lived to see him become one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys, but he knew she'd be proud. The annual Justice for All Foundation Gala was one of the biggest events in the legal community. As the keynote speaker, Jordan had spent weeks perfecting his address about community policing reform. His successful prosecution of Officer Harber 10 years ago had launched his career, but it was the systemic changes he'd helped implement since then that truly mattered. Traffic thinned as he turned onto Riverside Drive, the convention center's glass facade gleaming ahead. The valet stand was already busy with arriving guests, judges, politicians, community leaders. Jordan checked his watch. Still 30 minutes until his speech. His phone chirped with a text from his assistant confirming his talking points were loaded into the teleprompter. Jordan smiled, remembering how he used to practice speeches in front of his bathroom mirror. Now he addressed thousands with confidence, his words helping shape policy and change lives. The convention center's lights grew closer, and Jordan could see the red carpet leading to the entrance. Camera flashes sparkled as photographers captured arriving guests. He'd come so far from that kid who once thought justice was just a dream. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, accompanied by a short siren burst. Jordan checked his speed. He'd been well under the limit. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he signaled and began pulling over. Something felt off. The timing, the location, the empty stretch of road. A voice in his head warned, "Something's not right." Jordan eased the Tesla to a stop along the darkened stretch of Riverside Drive. Through his side mirror, he watched a figure emerge from the patrol car, moving with deliberate slowness. Something about the officer's gait seemed familiar. The beam of a flashlight cut through his rear window. Jordan's hands remained visible on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained from conversations he'd had with countless black clients over the years. The officer's footsteps crunched on loose gravel, drawing closer. A tap on the window made Jordan flinch. He pressed the button to lower it, and the cool night air rushed in. When he turned to face the officer, his blood ran cold. The years had weathered Gerald Harber's face, but those cold eyes were unmistakable. "License and registration," Harber drawled, shining the flashlight directly into Jordan's eyes. He was wearing what looked like a real police uniform, complete with a badge that caught the light. "Harber," Jordan said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his system. "You're not a real officer anymore. This is impersonation." A cruel smile twisted Harber's features. "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen earlier this evening." His voice carried the same menacing tone from the courtroom a decade ago. "Dark-colored Tesla, same model, same plates." Jordan's mind raced. The convention center was just ahead, filled with people who could help. His phone lay on the passenger seat, but reaching for it might escalate the situation. "You and I both know this car isn't stolen," Jordan said firmly. "I have the documentation right here." "Step out of the vehicle," Harber commanded, his hand resting meaningfully on his hip where a holster was visible. "Now!" Jordan weighed his options. The street was deserted, the convention center just far enough away that shouting would be useless. Harber's posture suggested he was ready for resistance. "This won't end well for you," Jordan warned, but Harber's expression didn't change. "Out of the car." With calculated slowness, Jordan unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The moment his shoes touched the pavement, Harber grabbed his arm and roughly steered him away from the vehicle. "Face the wall. Hands where I can see them," Harber barked. Jordan complied, his mind already cataloging every detail for the police report he'd file later. The fake badge number, the patrol car's markings, the specific words Harber used. Behind him, he heard the Tesla's door open and close. The electric hum of the motor starting up seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. Jordan turned just in time to see Harber slide behind the wheel of his car, that same cruel smile visible through the window. Consider this interest on an old debt, Harbor called out as he pulled away, leaving Jordan standing in the pool of light from the abandoned patrol car's headlights. Jordan watched his car disappear around the corner, his fists clenched at his sides. The fury building inside him was tempered by the grim satisfaction of knowing Harbor had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Jordan's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out his phone. The night air had grown colder, and the empty patrol car's headlights cast long shadows across the street. He quickly dialed Samuel Thomas's number, knowing his tech lead would still be working late at the office. Samuel answered on the second ring. "Jordan, aren't you supposed to be at the gala?" "Samuel, I need your help. Harbor just stole my car." Jordan's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Tell me you can track it." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by the sound of rapid typing. "The custom surveillance system we installed after the break-in attempt last month, it's still active. Give me a minute." Jordan paced back and forth, his expensive dress shoes clicking against the pavement. He could hear Samuel muttering under his breath as keyboards clacked in the background. "Got it." Samuel's voice crackled through the speaker. "The car's GPS shows it heading east on Marshall Avenue. But that's not all. The internal cameras are working too. I'm pulling up the feed now." Jordan's phone buzzed with an incoming video link. He tapped it, and his screen filled with a crystal-clear view of his car's interior. Harbor sat in the driver's seat, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights. "Can you record this?" Jordan asked. "Already am," Samuel replied. "Every frame, from every angle. Wait, he's pulling over." They watched as Harbor parked the Tesla in a dimly lit alley. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Zoom in on that," Jordan instructed, his stomach tightening with anticipation. Samuel enhanced the image. The package crinkled as Harbor unwrapped it, revealing a plastic bag filled with white powder. With practiced movements, he popped open the glove compartment and carefully placed the bag inside. "He's planting drugs," Samuel said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Classic dirty cop move." Jordan watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenched. This isn't just a setup, it's revenge. As Harbor finished planting the drugs, he slammed the glove compartment shut with a satisfied smirk. The sharp sound echoed through the car's interior, triggering a silent alert that he couldn't see. Deep within the Tesla's sophisticated computer system, emergency protocols activated, sending a direct feed to the local police department's dispatch center. At the station, dispatcher Sophia's screen lit up with multiple alerts. Her eyes widened as she watched the real-time footage of a man in a police uniform tampering with evidence inside a luxury electric vehicle. The system automatically cross-referenced the car's registration with recent incident reports, revealing Jordan Carter as the owner. "All units in the vicinity of 42nd and Pine," Sophia's voice crackled over the radio. "We have a 1031 in progress. Suspect wearing police uniform, possible impersonation. Approach with caution." Harbor, oblivious to the silent alarm, pulled out his phone and began typing what he assumed would be an anonymous tip about drugs in Jordan's car. The irony of his situation was lost on him as two patrol cars silently pulled up at both ends of the alley, their lights off. 4 officers emerged from their vehicles, weapons drawn. Officer Martinez took point, her voice cutting through the night air. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." Harbor's head snapped up, his face draining of color as he realized he was surrounded. He froze for a moment, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he no longer had the right to carry. "Hands up, now!" Officer Martinez's command left no room for argument. Slowly, Harbor raised his hands and opened the car door. The officers moved in swiftly, securing him while another checked the glove compartment. The planted drugs were exactly where the surveillance footage had shown them being placed. "Gerald Harbor," Officer Martinez said, reading his ID, "you're under arrest for impersonating a police officer, grand theft auto, and possession with intent to distribute." Back at the scene of the initial stop, Jordan watched the entire arrest unfold on his phone screen. Samuel still on the line. The advanced security system they'd installed had worked perfectly, catching every moment of Harbor's failed attempt at revenge in pristine HD quality. "That was fast," Jordan said with a satisfied smirk, watching as the officers led Harbor away in handcuffs. The fluorescent lights of the county jail's media room cast harsh shadows across Harbor's face as he stood before a cluster of reporters. His orange jumpsuit clashed with the institutional beige walls behind him, but his expression remained defiant. Camera flashes punctuated the tense atmosphere as he gripped the podium with white-knuckled hands. "Jordan Carter isn't the saint everyone thinks he is," Harbor declared, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. 10 years ago, he bribed witnesses to testify against me. He fabricated evidence to destroy my career." The reporters leaned forward, microphones thrust toward him like spears. Harbor's words sparked an immediate frenzy, pens scratching frantically against notepads. "I have proof," Harbor continued, though he offered none. "Carter's whole career is built on lies and corruption. He's no better than the criminals he claims to fight against." Within hours, the accusation spread like wildfire across social media. Carter corruption began trending, with users sharing and reshaping Harbor's claims. News channels picked up the story, running endless loops of Harbor's statement alongside archived footage of Jordan's past cases. In his downtown office, Jordan sat at his desk, watching the chaos unfold on multiple screens. Each news channel seemed to be running a different angle of the same story. Some questioned his entire legal career, while others dug into his past cases, looking for patterns that might support Harbor's accusations. His phone buzzed constantly, with messages from colleagues, friends, and reporters seeking comments. The local bar association had already called twice. Even his mother had texted, asking if he was okay. Jordan's jaw clenched as he watched a prominent legal commentator speculate about the possibility of reviewing all his past cases. The implications were staggering, not just for him, but for every client he'd ever represented, every cause he'd fought for. The door to his office burst open, and Claire Bennett rushed in, her tablet clutched to her chest. Her usually perfectly styled blonde hair looked slightly disheveled, and her blue eyes were wide with concern. "The media's eating this up," she warned, her voice tight with worry. She held up her tablet, showing him the latest social media metrics. The numbers were climbing by the minute, each new share and comment adding fuel to the fire of speculation and doubt. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as a growing crowd gathered outside Jordan's office building. Hand-painted signs bobbed up and down, their messages ranging from "Investigate Carter" to "No more corruption." The protesters' chants echoed off the glass and steel facades of downtown, their voices growing louder with each passing minute. Inside his office, Jordan watched the scene unfold from his 20th floor window. Claire stood beside him, her tablet displaying live social media feeds of the protest. Local news vans had begun arriving, their satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. "Most of them don't even know me," Jordan said quietly, his reflection frowning back at him in the window glass. "They're just angry at a system they think failed them, and Harbor's given them a target." The crowd below had swelled to nearly 100 people. Some wore shirts with Harbor's face printed on them, while others carried enlarged photos of cases Jordan had won over the years, each marked with a large red X. "Security called," Claire reported, scrolling through her messages. "They've set up barriers at the building entrance, but people are still trying to get in. They're demanding statements, interviews." A police car rolled slowly past the protesters, its presence drawing angry shouts from the crowd. Jordan watched as several people rushed toward the vehicle, their signs raised higher, their faces contorted with anger. "They're playing right into Harbor's hands," Jordan muttered. "He's turned this into exactly what he wanted. A circus." The elevator dinged, and Samuel rushed in, his laptop under his arm. "You need to see this," he said, setting up at the conference table. "They're organizing on social media. It's not just random protesters anymore. Someone's coordinating this." Jordan moved away from the window to look at Samuel's screen. Dozens of posts scrolled past, all carefully crafted to stoke outrage. Many contained old photos of Jordan with wealthy clients, suggesting improper relationships. Others questioned how a lawyer from his background could afford his lifestyle. "Look at the timing," Samuel pointed out. "These posts started appearing hours before Harbor made his statement. Someone was preparing this campaign in advance." Claire's phone buzzed with another notification. "The Bar Association wants to meet with you tomorrow morning," she said. "And 3 major clients have already called to express their concerns." Below, the crowd had begun a new chant, their voices rising in unified anger. "Carter must go! Carter must go!" Jordan straightened his tie and walked back to the window. The morning sun had risen higher now, glinting off car windshields and building windows. The protesters' signs cast shifting shadows on the pavement, like dark fingers reaching for the building's entrance. His mind raced through options, strategies, counterattacks. Every fiber of his being wanted to rush downstairs and confront them, to defend his reputation face to face. But that's exactly what Harbor would want. An emotional reaction, a mistake, anything to validate the accusations. Jordan's reflection stared back at him, superimposed over the crowd below. He saw in his own eyes the same determination that had driven him to become a lawyer, to fight against corruption and injustice. The same fire that had helped him win against Harbor 10 years ago still burned. His jaw tightened as he watched another wave of protesters join the crowd. "If they want to fight," he said, "they've got one." Owen Bailey, a 40-year-old white cop loyal to Harbor, meets with Oliver Hayes. In a dimly lit corner booth of Murphy's Bar, Owen Bailey hunched over his third beer, his police badge tucked safely in his jacket pocket. The establishment's worn wooden tables and faded sports memorabilia provided the perfect cover for conversations meant to stay private. The evening crowd's chatter created a constant murmur that masked hushed discussions. Oliver Hayes slid into the seat across from him, his weathered face bearing the hard lines of 20 years on the force. A manila envelope sat tucked under his arm, thick with papers. "Took you long enough," Owen muttered, checking his watch. The meeting had been set for 7, and it was nearly 8. "Had to make sure I wasn't followed," Oliver replied, ordering a whiskey from a passing waitress. "These days, you can't be too careful, especially with what we're about to discuss." Owen leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Gerald's counting on us, after what Carter did to him." He shook his head, remembering how Harbor had mentored him during his rookie years. "Carter needs to be stopped," Oliver said, his voice hard with conviction. He pulled out the envelope and spread several documents across the table, careful to keep them away from the condensation rings left by Owen's beer glass. "What are we looking at?" Owen asked, squinting at the papers in the dim light. "Bank statements, wire transfers, donation records from Carter's charity foundation," Oliver explained, pointing to various documents. "With a few adjustments, we can make it look like he's been skimming money for years." Owen picked up one of the statements, studying the columns of numbers. "How'd you get these?" "Let's just say I still have friends in the financial crimes unit," Oliver said with a thin smile. "They owe me favors." The waitress returned with Oliver's whiskey, and both men fell silent until she walked away. Oliver pulled out a laptop from his bag and opened a spreadsheet. See these charitable donations? He pointed to a column of figures. We can create a pattern showing small amounts being diverted to offshore accounts. Nothing too obvious, just enough to raise suspicions. Owen nodded slowly, remembering how Jordan Carter had testified against several of his former colleagues over the years. What about the electronic trail? Won't they trace it? Already thought of that, Oliver said, pulling up another document. I've got a contact who can backdate digital transactions. By the time anyone investigates, the evidence will look like it's been there for years. They spent the next hour carefully altering numbers, creating false transaction records, and building a web of financial misconduct that would stand up to initial scrutiny. Oliver's experience with internal affairs investigations proved invaluable in knowing exactly what auditors would look for. The beauty of it, Oliver explained as he modified another spreadsheet, is that we're using real donations and real accounts. We're just adjusting the flow of money. Makes it harder to prove it's fake. Owen watched as Oliver methodically built their case against Jordan, feeling a mix of satisfaction and unease. The fabricated evidence was convincing, perhaps too convincing. This could really destroy him, he said, almost to himself. That's the point, Oliver replied, not looking up from his work. His whole reputation is built on being incorruptible. Once these records surface, no one will trust him again. The bar had grown quieter as the evening wore on. A few patrons remained at the counter, paying no attention to the two men in the corner booth. Oliver saved their work onto a secure drive and began gathering the papers. We'll need to plant these records in the system gradually, he said, carefully returning everything to the envelope. Make it look natural. I've got access to the charity's financial database through a contact in IT. Samuel burst into Jordan's office early Monday morning, his usual composed demeanor replaced by visible concern. His laptop was already open as he rushed to Jordan's desk, nearly knocking over a stack of case files. Jordan, we've got a serious problem, Samuel said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Someone's leaked financial records from the Foundation online. They're showing irregular patterns in the charitable donations. Jordan set down his coffee mug, his expression shifting from confusion to alertness. What kind of patterns? Samuel turned the laptop screen toward Jordan. Look at these transaction records. According to these documents, small amounts have been consistently diverted to offshore accounts over the past 5 years. He pointed to several highlighted entries. The numbers are subtle enough to have gone unnoticed during routine audits, but when you add them up, they paint a picture of systematic embezzlement, Jordan finished, his jaw tightening as he studied the figures. The documentation looked legitimate at first glance, official letterheads, proper formatting, all the expected signatures in place. Exactly, Samuel said, pulling up another window. These records started appearing on financial watchdog websites about an hour ago. They're already being picked up by major news outlets. Jordan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The timing was too perfect, coming right after Harbor's accusations of bribery. He could see the strategy behind it. First, plant seeds of doubt about his integrity, then provide seemingly concrete evidence of corruption. Can you trace where these records originated? Jordan asked, though he already suspected the answer. Samuel shook his head. They've been careful. The uploads came through multiple proxy servers, bouncing through at least 6 different countries. But, he paused, pulling up another screen. There's something interesting about the metadata in these files. What do you see? The timestamps don't match up, Samuel explained, zooming in on the document properties. Some of these files show creation dates that are impossible, like modifications made to documents before they were supposedly created. It's subtle, but it's there if you know where to look. Jordan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The morning sun cast long shadows across the buildings, reminding him of how quickly darkness could spread. He'd built his reputation on fighting corruption, on being the voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Now someone was trying to use that same system against him. "This isn't amateur work," Jordan said, turning back to Samuel. "These records would fool most auditors. Someone with inside knowledge put this together." Samuel nodded grimly. "I've been monitoring police department communications channels. There's been increased activity between several officers who were close to Harbor." "Harbor doesn't have the expertise to pull this off alone," Jordan said, laying the paper back down. "He's got help from inside the department, probably from someone with experience in financial crimes." The implications hit him like a physical weight. The Foundation's work in community outreach, the legal aid programs for underprivileged families, the scholarship funds, all of it could be jeopardized if these allegations gain traction. Jordan looked at the growing list of news outlets picking up the story, then at the stack of case files on his desk representing people who were counting on him. His expression hardened with determination as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This isn't just about Harbor," he said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "They're trying to destroy everything I've built." Laura Harbor stood in Jordan's office, her hands clasped tightly together, worry lines etched deep around her eyes. Her son Charlie, a lanky 15-year-old with his father's sharp features but softer eyes, hung back near the door, shoulders hunched beneath his oversized hoodie. "Mr. Carter," Laura began, her voice trembling slightly, "I know we have no right to ask anything of you, especially after what Gerald did." Jordan gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Please sit down." Laura sank into one of the leather chairs, while Charlie remained standing, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The morning light streaming through the windows highlighted the dark circles under Laura's eyes and the worn fabric of her jacket. "Gerald made his choices," she continued, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. "But there are officers, his old friends. They've been watching our house, making comments when Charlie walks to school." She glanced at her son, who stared at the floor. "Last week, someone threw a brick through our kitchen window." Jordan leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Have you filed a police report?" A bitter laugh escaped Laura's lips. "With who? The same department where Gerald worked? Where do his friends still work?" She shook her head. "They'd just lose the paperwork." Charlie finally spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "Mom lost her job at the school. They said budget cuts, but it was right after Dad got arrested again." He moved closer to his mother's chair, protective despite his obvious fear. "The neighbors won't talk to us anymore, even people at church." Laura reached up and squeezed her son's hand. "I'm not defending what Gerald did, what he's become." She swallowed hard. "But if he gets another harsh sentence, his friends will blame us for not doing enough to help him. They'll make sure we know it too." Jordan watched them both, a mother and son caught in the crossfire of one man's vendetta, the weight of their situation pressed against his chest. Here were two more victims of Gerald's actions, but unlike Gerald's other targets, they shared his name and bore the burden of his choices. "We're not asking you to drop the charges," Laura said quickly. "Just, maybe there's a way to resolve this that doesn't put us in more danger." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Charlie's hand tightened on her shoulder. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic below. Jordan studied them both, Laura's desperate hope and Charlie's barely concealed fear. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, trying to be strong while watching his world crumble. But where Jordan had faced systemic injustice, Charlie faced the consequences of his father's hatred. Jordan listened without speaking, his mind wrestling with the complex web of justice, mercy, and unintended consequences. The morning sun cast long shadows across his desk, mirroring the moral shadows he now found himself navigating. Laura wiped a tear from her cheek, waiting for his response. Charlie finally sat down beside her, his young face marked by worry far beyond his years. They both looked at Jordan, their future hanging on his next words. Marcus Reed's weathered police badge caught the fluorescent light as he carefully closed Jordan's office door behind him. The veteran sergeant's salt-and-pepper hair and deep laugh lines spoke to his years of service, but there was nothing tired about his determined expression. "Mr. Carter," Marcus said, his voice low but firm, "what I'm about to share with you stays between us." He placed a thick manila envelope on Jordan's desk, his dark fingers lingering on its surface for a moment. Jordan leaned forward, his tie loosened after a long day of damage control. "Sergeant Reed, I appreciate you coming, but—" "Those boys, Owen and Oliver," Marcus interrupted, settling into the chair across from Jordan. "They've been running their mouths at the precinct, thinking everyone's on their side." He tapped the envelope. "But some of us still believe in doing what's right." Jordan carefully opened the envelope, spreading its contents across his desk. Photos, text messages, surveillance footage stills, a paper trail of conspiracy laid bare before him. His eyes widened as he scanned an internal memo detailing Owen and Oliver's late-night meetings. "They've been sloppy," Marcus continued, pointing to a particular photo showing the two officers exchanging documents in the police station parking lot. "Too confident nobody would dare speak against them. But I've been watching, recording, gathering evidence." Jordan studied a printed email chain revealing Oliver's communications with a known hacker. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, looking up at Marcus. The sergeant's face softened slightly. 28 years on the force, Mr. Carter. I've seen good cops and bad cops. Seen justice served and justice denied." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "What they're doing to you, it's not just about Harbor anymore. It's about maintaining a system that protects its own, no matter how corrupt." Jordan spread out more documents, each piece adding to the puzzle of Owen and Oliver's scheme. Bank statements showed suspicious transfers. Surveillance logs documented their unauthorized access to financial databases. "You're not alone in this fight," Marcus said, standing up. "There are still those of us who remember why we took the badge in the first place." He straightened his uniform jacket, years of pride and principle evident in his bearing. Jordan gathered the evidence, his mind already formulating strategies. The weight of the documents in his hands felt like ammunition, powerful, precise, and exactly what he needed. "Thank you," Jordan said, extending his hand to Marcus. The sergeant's grip was firm, a silent promise of solidarity. As Marcus turned to leave, Jordan began organizing the evidence, a familiar fire rekindling in his chest. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing a deeper corruption, one that had festered too long in the shadows. He spread the documents across his desk once more, methodically arranging them into a compelling narrative of corruption and conspiracy. Each piece of evidence strengthened his resolve, reminding him why he'd become a lawyer in the first place. Looking at the damning collection before him, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose surge through him. "Let's take them down," he said, his voice steady and determined. The press room buzzed with anticipation as Jordan Carter stepped up to the podium. Camera flashes lit up his face, and microphones clustered before him like eager flowers reaching for the sun. His navy suit was crisp, his posture straight and confident despite the weeks of accusations that had weighed on his shoulders. "Good morning," Jordan began, his voice clear and steady. "I stand before you today not just to defend my reputation, but to expose a disturbing pattern of corruption within our police department." He gestured to the large screen behind him, where the first piece of evidence appeared. Surveillance footage showing Owen and Oliver in the police station parking lot, exchanging documents under cover of darkness. "These officers," Jordan continued, "orchestrated a campaign of deception, aimed at discrediting me and protecting their corrupt interests. His fingers moved deliberately through the stack of documents before him, each page telling another part of the story. The room fell silent as Jordan displayed email chains and bank records. Text messages between Owen and Oliver flashed across the screen, their words damning in their clarity. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens scratching furiously across notepads. This evidence comes from a courageous whistleblower within the department, Jordan explained, his voice gaining strength. Someone who chose integrity over loyalty to a corrupt system. He didn't mention Marcus Reed by name, protecting his source while honoring his bravery. Jordan methodically laid out the conspiracy, piece by piece. He showed how Owen and Oliver had hired a hacker to fabricate financial records, their digital fingerprints clear in the metadata. He revealed their connection to Gerald Harbor and their shared vendetta against him. These officers betrayed not only their badges, but the public trust, Jordan declared, his words carrying to every corner of the room. They attempted to destroy my reputation because I dared to challenge their system of protection for corrupt officers. Questions erupted from the assembled reporters. Jordan handled each one with practiced ease, directing attention to specific pieces of evidence that supported his claims. The truth, laid bare under the bright lights, was undeniable. Across town in a dimly lit bar, Owen and Oliver sat side by side, their eyes fixed on the mounted TV screen. Owen's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his glass, while Oliver's face had drained of color. They watched as their carefully constructed plan crumbled under the weight of Jordan's evidence. The camera zoomed in on Jordan's face as he held up the final piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Owen and Oliver discussing their plan to frame him for embezzlement. Their own voices filled the bar, tinny but unmistakable, through the TV speakers. Owen's glass clinked against his teeth as he took another nervous sip. Oliver tugged at his collar, his breathing shallow and quick. They watched their careers, their reputations, their freedom slipping away with each new revelation. "We're in trouble," Owen muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their recorded conspiracy playing on the news. The Internal Affairs Office hummed with activity as investigators pored over the evidence Jordan Carter had presented. Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran IA officer, spread photographs and documents across her desk, building a timeline of Owen and Oliver's activities. Within hours of Jordan's press conference, both officers received official notices of suspension. 2 uniformed officers collected their badges and service weapons, leading them out of the precinct under the watchful eyes of their former colleagues. "This is ridiculous," Owen protested, his face red with anger as he handed over his badge. "You can't seriously believe Carter's lies." Oliver remained silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat as he watched years of service reduced to a walk of shame through the station. The weight of their actions pressed down on them both as they stepped into the harsh daylight outside. Detective Martinez's investigation moved swiftly. Her team uncovered additional evidence of misconduct stretching back years before their conspiracy against Jordan. Bank records revealed suspicious deposits. Witness statements painted a picture of intimidation and abuse of power. In the county jail, Gerald Harbor paced his cell, his rage building with each news report about Owen and Oliver's suspension. His last allies were falling, and with them, his hopes for revenge against Jordan Carter crumbled. A guard approached Harbor's cell. "Your lawyer's here," he announced, unlocking the door. In the visitation room, Harbor's public defender laid out their options. "The DA's offering a deal," she explained, sliding a document across the table. "They want your testimony against Officers Bailey and Hayes. In exchange, they'll reduce your sentence." Harbor's jaw clenched as he read the terms. His hands shook with barely contained fury. Everything was falling apart. Owen and Oliver were supposed to be his backup plan, his way of making Jordan pay even if he got caught. Now they were just another weapon to use against him. "Those idiots couldn't even frame someone properly," Harbour muttered, crumpling the edge of the document. He stared at the wall, considering his options. His hatred for Jordan burned hot in his chest, but self-preservation began to win out. "Fine," he spat, turning back to his lawyer. "I'll tell them everything about Owen and Oliver's little scheme. They wanted to help me get revenge on Carter, and they screwed it up just like everything else." His lawyer pushed a pen across the table. Harbour grabbed it, his signature sharp and angry across the bottom of the agreement. As he wrote, his face twisted into a bitter smile. If he was going down, he'd make sure to take Owen and Oliver with him. "At least I'll get something out of this mess," Harbour said, dropping the pen. "And those two can learn what it feels like when someone turns on them." Jordan sat at his mother's kitchen table, the familiar scent of her sweet potato pie filling the air. Evelyn Carter's weathered hands wrapped around her teacup as she gazed at her son with eyes full of hard-earned wisdom. "You know, baby," she began, her voice soft but strong, "seeing you fight these battles reminds me of what your daddy and I went through back in the day." Jordan leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. His mother rarely spoke about those times, and when she did, he knew to listen carefully. "I remember applying for a teaching position at Marshall Elementary in 702, Evelyn continued, smoothing her apron. "I had all the qualifications, top of my class, 3 years experience, glowing recommendations. But they took one look at me, and suddenly the position was already filled." She shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "What did you do?" Jordan asked, though he'd heard pieces of this story before. "Well, I could have gotten angry, could have let that bitterness eat me up inside. Lord knows I wanted to." Evelyn reached across the table and placed her hand over Jordan's. "Instead, I gathered other black teachers who'd been turned away. We documented everything, built a case, worked with the NAACP." She paused, taking a sip of her tea. "It took 2 years, but we got that school district to change their hiring practices, not just for one school, but for the whole county." Pride crept into her voice. "And you know what? I ended up teaching there for 30 years, helped shape hundreds of young minds, black, white, and everything in between." Jordan absorbed his mother's words, thinking about Harbour, Owen, and Oliver. He'd been so focused on proving them wrong, on winning the immediate battle, that he'd almost lost sight of the bigger picture. "The thing is, son," Evelyn continued, her eyes meeting Jordan's, "justice isn't about vengeance. It's about making things right. Those men who tried to hurt you, they're symptoms of a bigger problem. You can take them down one by one, but there'll always be more, unless the system itself changes." She squeezed his hand. "You've got a platform now. People listen when you speak. Use that power to fix what's broken, not just to punish those who broke it." Jordan felt something shift inside him as he listened to his mother's words. The anger that had been driving him began to transform into something more purposeful. He thought about all the other black men and women who'd faced similar situations, but didn't have his resources or platform to fight back. "I hear you, Mama," he said softly. "Maybe it's time to think bigger than just winning this case." "That's my boy," Evelyn smiled, standing to check on her pie. "Sometimes the best revenge is making sure nobody else has to go through what you did." Jordan watched his mother move around her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd graded papers late into the night, planning lessons that would shape young minds and challenge prejudices. He thought about her quiet strength, her determination to create lasting change rather than settle for quick victories. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as Jordan stood before the gathered community leaders. Religious figures, civil rights activists, neighborhood representatives, and even a few progressive police officers filled the chairs around the long mahogany table. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over the diverse group. "Thank you all for coming today," Jordan began, his voice steady and clear. "We're here because we share a common goal, making our community safer and fairer for everyone." He clicked through his presentation, showing statistics and data that highlighted the systemic issues within local law enforcement. "These numbers tell a story," he explained, "but behind each one is a real person, a family, a life changed forever." Reverend Marcus Thompson, a respected figure in the Black community, leaned forward. "We've heard promises before, Mr. Carter. What makes your proposal different?" Jordan nodded, acknowledging the skepticism. "Because this isn't just about punishment or oversight. It's about healing and prevention." He outlined his restorative justice initiative, explaining how it would bring together offenders, victims, and community members to address harm and build understanding. "Instead of just locking people up," he continued, "we create opportunities for dialogue, rehabilitation, and real change. Officers would undergo extensive cultural competency training. We'd establish community review boards with actual power to influence policy." Captain Sarah Rodriguez, one of the few female police commanders in the district, raised her hand. "This is ambitious, Mr. Carter. How do you plan to get buy-in from the department?" "By showing them it works," Jordan replied. "We start with pilot programs in willing precincts. When officers see reduced tensions and increased community cooperation, others will follow." Dr. James Chen, head of the Asian American Community Center, spoke up. "Our communities have different needs and concerns. How does your initiative address that?" Jordan walked around the table, making eye contact with each leader. "That's exactly why we need all of you involved. This isn't my initiative, it's ours. Each community will have a voice in shaping how it's implemented in their neighborhood." The discussion continued, with leaders raising concerns and offering suggestions. Jordan listened carefully, taking notes and adjusting his proposal based on their input. Hours passed as they worked through the details. Finally, Reverend Thompson stood up. "I've seen a lot of reform proposals come and go," he said, looking around the room. "But this one's different. Mr. Carter isn't just talking about changing rules. He's talking about changing hearts and minds. I'm in." One by one, the other leaders voiced their support. Captain Rodriguez pledged to pilot the program in her precinct. Dr. Chen offered his center as a meeting space for community dialogues. Rabbi Goldman promised to mobilize interfaith groups to support the initiative. As the last leader gave their endorsement, Jordan felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't about personal vindication anymore. It was about creating lasting change. The room filled with determined nods and murmurs of agreement, marking a crucial turning point in the fight for justice. The community center auditorium was packed to capacity. People stood along the walls and sat in folding chairs hastily brought in to accommodate the overflow crowd. The air hummed with anticipation as Jordan Carter stepped up to the podium, adjusting his tie before scanning the diverse faces before him. "Look around you," Jordan began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Look at who's sitting next to you. We have police officers next to activists, business owners next to community organizers. People of all races, religions, and backgrounds coming together for one purpose: to make our community better." He paused, letting his words sink in. The overhead lights cast a warm glow across the gathering, highlighting the nodding heads and attentive faces. 10 years ago, I stood in a courtroom fighting corruption. I thought that was enough. But I've learned that real change isn't about winning cases. It's about winning hearts. Jordan stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the edge of the stage. We can't arrest our way to a better society. We can't legislate away distrust. The only way forward is together. These brave individuals have already committed to our restorative justice initiative. They understand that true justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about healing wounds that have festered for generations. Jordan shared stories from the pilot program. A young officer who now regularly played basketball with neighborhood kids, a former gang member mentoring at-risk youth, a victim of theft who found peace through dialogue with the perpetrator. This isn't just theory anymore, he continued, his voice rising with passion. We're seeing real results. Crime rates are down in pilot areas. Community trust is up. Officers report feeling more connected to the people they serve. We stand at a crossroads, Jordan declared, his voice strong and clear. We can choose the path of division, fear, and revenge. Or we can choose unity, understanding, and growth. I know which path I'm choosing. Who's with me? The response was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd rose to their feet, applause thundering through the auditorium. People turned to their neighbors, shaking hands and exchanging contact information. Some were wiping tears from their eyes, moved by the vision of hope Jordan had presented. Meanwhile, in a prison cell miles away, Gerald Harbor sat on his narrow bunk, watching the speech on a small television mounted high on the wall. His weathered face showed conflicting emotions as he watched Jordan work the crowd. The bitter lines around his mouth softened slightly as he observed the genuine response from the diverse audience. Harbor's cellmate called out, "That lawyer's got some nerve, huh?" But Harbor didn't respond immediately. He watched as the camera panned across the cheering crowd, showing the unlikely alliances forming before his eyes. Finally, he shook his head slowly and muttered, "Maybe I underestimated him." The city council chambers buzzed with energy as council members shuffled papers and adjusted their microphones. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Jordan Carter sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, watching as Council President Maria Rodriguez called the session to order. Today we vote on Resolution 2437, the Community Justice Reform Initiative, Rodriguez announced, her voice steady and clear through the speakers. Jordan's heart raced as the council members began their final deliberations. He'd spent months working with each of them, addressing concerns and refining the proposals. The initiative would revolutionize how the city handled community policing, implementing restorative justice programs and mandatory cultural sensitivity training. Councilman James Chen spoke first. "I've seen the data from the pilot programs. The results are undeniable. Crime rates down 30%, community satisfaction up 60%, officer retention improved by 40%. Councilwoman Patricia Washington nodded in agreement. "What impresses me most is the broad coalition supporting this initiative. We have the police union, community activists, business leaders, and religious organizations all backing these reforms." One by one, council members voiced their support. They praised the careful balance between accountability and support, the focus on prevention rather than punishment, and the emphasis on building bridges between law enforcement and communities. When the time came to vote, Jordan held his breath. The chamber fell silent as Rodriguez called the roll. "Councilman Chen?" "Aye." "Councilwoman Washington?" "Aye." "Councilman Martinez?" "Aye." The votes continued, each affirmative response causing Jordan's smile to grow wider. When the final tally was announced, unanimous approval, the chamber erupted in applause. Jordan closed his eyes briefly, savoring the moment. News of the vote spread quickly. Within hours, Jordan's phone was buzzing with calls from neighboring cities requesting copies of the proposal and guidance on implementation. The mayor of Riverside wanted to know how soon they could start their own pilot program. The police chief from Millbrook asked about training protocols. That evening, in a modest home across town, Evelyn Carter sat in her favorite armchair, watching the news coverage unfold on her television. The familiar anchor's voice filled the room. In a historic vote today, the City Council unanimously approved the Community Justice Reform Initiative, marking a significant shift in local law enforcement policy. The screen showed clips from the council meeting, followed by interviews with community members. Evelyn's eyes glistened with pride as Jordan appeared on screen, speaking to reporters outside City Hall. He looked confident and composed in his navy suit, his voice carrying the same passion she'd heard in him as a child, when he'd first talked about becoming a lawyer to help people. The news anchor continued, "Already several neighboring cities have expressed interest in adopting similar measures, with some calling this the beginning of a regional transformation in community policing." Evelyn reached for her phone and sent a simple text to her son. "Turn on Channel 5. A few minutes later, Jordan called. Before he could speak, Evelyn's warm voice filled the line. "You've done it, Jordan." The autumn sun had barely risen when Owen Bailey and Oliver Hayes pulled their packed SUV onto Interstate 95. Dark circles hung under their eyes from a sleepless night of hasty planning. A duffel bag stuffed with cash sat between them, their emergency fund for starting new lives. "We should make it to Georgia by nightfall," Owen said, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. His police badge, which he'd worn proudly for 15 years, now lay discarded in a trash can at his house. Oliver kept checking the rearview mirror, his weathered face tight with anxiety. "You think anyone's onto us?" "Nah, we covered our tracks. By the time they figure out we're gone, we'll be—" Owen's words cut off as red and blue lights flashed behind them. "Don't stop," Oliver urged, but Owen shook his head. "That'll just make it worse." He guided the SUV onto the shoulder, heart pounding. In their rearview mirror, a tall figure emerged from the police cruiser. Sergeant Marcus Reed approached with measured steps, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "Well, well," Marcus called out, his deep voice carrying easily through the morning air. "Going somewhere interesting?" Owen's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel. "Just a fishing trip, Sergeant." Marcus leaned down, looking through the driver's window. "With 3 suitcases, a duffel bag full of cash, and your passports? That must be some fishing trip." Oliver's face drained of color. "How did you—" "know?" Marcus straightened up, adjusting his sunglasses. "Let's just say a little bird told me you two might try something like this. Step out of the vehicle, please." As they emerged, 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Officers approached with handcuffs ready. "Owen Bailey and Oliver Hayes," Marcus announced formally. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution." Back in the city, Jordan sat in his office, watching the arrest unfold on the morning news. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Corrupt officers caught attempting to flee state." Claire brought him a cup of coffee, setting it on his desk. "They really thought they could just run away from all this?" Jordan shook his head, watching as Owen and Oliver were led away in handcuffs. The sight brought him relief, but he knew better than to celebrate too early. The corruption they'd uncovered went deeper than just these 2 officers. Their arrest was a victory, but only one of many battles ahead. "At least they won't be able to hurt anyone else," Jordan said quietly, reaching for his coffee. The news anchor's voice continued. "Sources say the arrests were made possible by an anonymous tip from within the department, leading to speculation about possible additional corruption cases yet to be revealed." Gerald Harbor sat at the small metal desk in his prison cell, staring at the blank piece of paper before him. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he picked up the stubby pencil he'd been given. His hands, once steady when holding a police badge, now trembled slightly. He'd spent weeks drafting this letter in his head, but now that he faced the actual task of writing it, the words felt stuck in his throat. The bitter anger that had fueled him for so long had finally burned out, leaving behind only ashes of regret. "Dear Mr. Carter," he began, then crossed it out. After a moment's thought, he started again. "Dear Jordan, I've written this letter 100 times in my head, but putting it on paper is harder than I thought it would be. Pride has always been my downfall, and even now it's fighting me. But I need to say this. I'm sorry. Those words feel small compared to what I've done, but they're true. I've spent 10 years blaming you for ruining my life, but the truth is, I ruined it myself. My actions, my choices, my hatred, they were all on me. When you prosecuted me the first time, I was too angry to see that you were just doing your job, fighting for what was right. I let that anger poison everything. My marriage, my relationship with my son, my whole life. Seeing Laura and Charlie visit you, hearing how they pleaded on my behalf despite everything I'd put them through, it broke something in me, something that needed breaking. I watched you on TV, talking about reform and healing. At first, I mocked those words, but they kept coming back to me in the quiet hours here. You could have pushed for revenge, but instead, you chose to fight for change. That takes a stronger person than I've ever been. I know this letter can't undo what I've done. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I haven't earned that. But I needed you to know that your work, your dedication to justice, it's finally gotten through to even someone as stubborn as me. I'll be testifying against Owen and Oliver next month. It's not much, but it's a start. Maybe it's time I tried to be part of the solution instead of the problem. Sincerely, Gerald Harbor. He read over the words, fighting the urge to crumple the paper and start again. Instead, he folded it carefully and slipped it into an envelope. The next morning, Jordan found the letter on his desk among his usual mail. He recognized the prison return address immediately, and his first instinct was to throw it away unopened. But something made him pause. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the careful handwriting. As he read, the tension in his shoulders gradually eased. The words weren't polished or elegant, but their rawness carried a ring of truth he hadn't expected. When he finished, Jordan set the letter down on his desk and leaned back in his chair. The morning sun streamed through his office window, warming his face as he considered Harbor's words. "Maybe he can change," Jordan said softly to himself. Jordan Carter stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, his hand resting lightly on the smooth marble railing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the imposing building's facade, its weathered stone columns reaching skyward like silent guardians of justice. 10 years had passed since he'd first climbed these steps as a young lawyer. Heart pounding with determination, case files clutched tightly against his chest. Now, at 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from hard-won victories and learned wisdom. He began ascending the steps slowly, each one bringing back memories. On the third step, he remembered his first major case win, a small victory that had given him the courage to take on bigger challenges. By the seventh step, he recalled the day he'd prosecuted Gerald Harbor, how his hands had trembled slightly as he delivered his opening statement. Jordan paused outside courtroom 3, where so many of his battles had been fought. Through the window in the door, he could see the empty judge's bench, the jury box where citizens had sat in judgment, the podium where he'd stood countless times arguing for justice. "Morning, Mr. Carter," called out Mrs. Thompson, the elderly court clerk who'd been there since his first day. Her warm smile hadn't changed in all these years. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Jordan replied, returning her smile. Just taking a walk down memory lane. You've come a long way from that nervous young lawyer who used to practice his arguments in empty courtrooms after hours, she said with a knowing look. Jordan chuckled, remembering those late nights when he'd stood alone in the courtroom, rehearsing until every word felt right. Those practice sessions paid off. He continued his walk through the building, each corridor holding its own memories. The bench near the water fountain, where he'd sat during breaks, reviewing evidence. The conference room where he'd negotiated his first plea deal. The quiet corner where he'd sometimes retreated to gather his thoughts before big cases. Finally, Jordan made his way back outside, squinting in the bright sunlight. His restored electric car sat waiting in the parking lot, its sleek surface gleaming. The vehicle had become a symbol of his resilience, damaged but rebuilt, stronger than before. As he settled into the driver's seat, his hand ran appreciatively over the steering wheel. The car's interior still held that fresh leather smell from the restoration, but everything else had been returned to its original state. Even the advanced security system that had helped catch Harbor was still there, though upgraded. Jordan started the engine, hearing its quiet hum come to life. Through the windshield, he could see the courthouse standing proud against the morning sky. So many chapters of his story had been written within those walls, each one shaping him into the person he'd become. With a gentle press on the accelerator, he pulled away from the curb. As the courthouse receded in his rearview mirror, Jordan smiled, ready for the next chapter. Jordan sat in his office, reviewing the thick envelope that had arrived that morning. The presidential seal caught the morning light, gleaming gold against the cream-colored paper. Inside was a formal invitation to join a federal task force on police reform, signed by several prominent senators and the Attorney General himself. Claire knocked softly before entering with a fresh cup of coffee. "I saw the letter arrive. Have you read it yet?" "3 times," Jordan replied, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. "They want me to help draft new legislation. Something comprehensive. Training reforms, accountability measures, community oversight." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city he'd fought so hard to change. The morning traffic flowed steadily below, people going about their daily lives in a community that felt different now, safer, more united. "They mentioned your success here," Claire said, picking up the letter. "They're calling it the Carter Model. Other cities are already adopting parts of your program." Jordan nodded, remembering the long hours of community meetings, the heated debates, the gradual building of trust between law enforcement and citizens. It hadn't been easy, but the results spoke for themselves. Crime rates were down, community engagement was up, and complaints against officers had dropped significantly. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Reed. "Heard about the invitation. You'd better say yes. We need you in D.C. Samuel poked his head in, tablet in hand. "The statistics from the first quarter are in. The new training protocols are showing even better results than we projected." Jordan studied the graphs Samuel pulled up, showing declining incident rates and improving response times. What they'd accomplished here could work on a national scale. The thought both excited and humbled him. The scale of it was daunting. National reform would mean dealing with different state laws, various police unions, diverse community needs across the country. But Jordan had learned that the principles remained the same: accountability, transparency, and respect. He picked up the phone and dialed the number provided in the letter. After a brief conversation with the Attorney General's office, Jordan set down the receiver and turned to Claire and Samuel. "I told them yes," he said simply. The grand ballroom of the National Justice Center sparkled with elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over hundreds of gathered guests, all dressed in their finest attire. At the center of it all stood Jordan Carter, adjusting his bow tie as he prepared to receive the Presidential Medal for Justice Reform. Jordan's voice carried through the hall as he spoke about his journey, from that first corruption case against Gerald Harbor to the nationwide changes he'd helped implement. Reform isn't just about changing laws, he said. It's about changing hearts and minds, about building bridges between communities that have been divided for far too long. Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Jordan described the lessons she'd taught him growing up. He spoke of her strength during times of discrimination, her dignity in the face of prejudice, and her unwavering belief in justice rather than vengeance. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and celebrated, Evelyn made her way to her son. Her arthritis made walking harder these days, but she stood tall and proud as she approached him. Jordan immediately excused himself from a conversation with two senators to meet her. "You've made me so proud," she said, reaching up to straighten his tie, just as she had done when he was a boy heading to his first debate competition. Jordan looked at his mother, seeing in her face all the years of sacrifice and wisdom that had shaped him. Every late night she'd worked to put him through school, every encouraging word when he'd faced discrimination, every piece of advice that had kept him focused on what truly mattered. He remembered her words during his darkest moments, when vengeance had seemed so tempting. She had reminded him that true justice wasn't about destroying others, but about building something better for everyone. Taking his mother's hands in his, Jordan kissed her forehead, saying, "I couldn't have done it without you." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Jordan's downtown office, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. Across from him sat Marcus Johnson, a bright-eyed law student whose determination reminded Jordan of himself at that age. "I watch every news report about your fight against corruption," Marcus said, his fingers drumming nervously on his notebook. "That's what made me want to become a lawyer." Jordan leaned back in his chair, studying the young man's eager expression. "The path isn't easy," he said. "There will be people who will try to stop you, who will say you don't belong." Marcus nodded, his shoulders straightening. "Like what happened with Officer Harbor and his friends." "That was just one battle," Jordan replied, standing to walk to the window. "The real challenge is staying focused on what matters, not letting anger or revenge cloud your judgment." Marcus followed him to the window, gazing out at the city below. "How did you do it? Stay focused, I mean." Jordan smiled, thinking of his mother's wisdom. "I had good teachers, people who reminded me that true change comes from building bridges, not burning them." "The key," Jordan explained, pointing to a highlighted section of text, "is documenting everything. Evidence speaks louder than emotions in court." Marcus absorbed every word, taking detailed notes. His eyes lit up when Jordan offered him an internship position for the summer. "Really?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with disbelief and excitement. "You'd take me on?" "Someone took a chance on me once," Jordan said, remembering his first mentor. "It's time I did the same for someone else." Down the hall, Evelyn had arrived early for her lunch date with Jordan. She paused in the doorway, watching her son guide the young law student through complex legal concepts. Her heart swelled with pride as she observed Jordan's patient explanations and encouraging words. As Jordan drew diagrams to illustrate a point about case precedents, Evelyn watched from her spot by the door, her smile growing wider. The torch was being passed to a new generation, and her son was helping to light the way. The grand ballroom of the National Justice Reform Conference buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of legal professionals, activists, and lawmakers filled the seats, their attention focused on the podium where Jordan Carter stood tall in his perfectly pressed navy suit. He took a deep breath, his hands resting lightly on either side of the lectern. The spotlight caught the silver at his temples, earned through years of fighting for what was right. 10 years ago, Jordan began, his voice clear and strong, I stood in a courtroom facing a man who represented everything wrong with our justice system. But today, I'm not here to talk about one corrupt officer. I'm here to talk about hope. These experiences taught me something crucial, he continued. Real change doesn't come from taking down individual bad actors. It comes from rebuilding the system from the ground up. Jordan clicked through his presentation, showing statistics and success stories from cities that had adopted his reform initiatives. In just 2 years, we've seen a 40% decrease in police misconduct cases. But more importantly, we've seen a 60% increase in community trust. The path forward isn't about division, Jordan said, his voice growing passionate. It's about unity. It's about creating a system that serves everyone equally, regardless of their race, background, or zip code. I remember sitting across from Laura Harbour and her son, Jordan shared, his voice softening. They showed me that behind every case, there are human beings affected by our decisions. Reform isn't just about changing laws. It's about changing lives. The room grew still as Jordan approached his conclusion. We stand at a crossroads. We can choose to remain trapped in cycles of revenge and retaliation, or we can choose to build something better. Together, we can create a justice system that truly lives up to its name. As Jordan spoke his final words, the audience rose as one. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous roar. People wiped tears from their eyes as they clapped. Some called out words of support and gratitude. In that moment, as the standing ovation continued, Jordan Carter's legacy was no longer just about one man's fight against corruption. It had become a blueprint for change, a testament to the power of perseverance and principle over bitterness and revenge. The applause echoed through the ballroom, a sound of hope and possibility, of battles won and changes yet to come. Jordan stood at the podium, humbled by the response, his vision for reform no longer just a dream, but a reality taking shape across the nation. Jordan Carter stood before a diverse crowd of eager law students at the inaugural launch of the Carter Justice Initiative. The university auditorium buzzed with energy as hundreds of young faces looked up at him, their expressions filled with hope and determination. When I started practicing law, Jordan began, adjusting his microphone, I had to figure everything out on my own. But you won't have to. His voice carried through the packed room with warmth and authority. Samuel Thomas, now his program director, handed out tablets containing the initiative's comprehensive mentorship curriculum. The devices gleamed in the auditorium lights as students powered them on, revealing carefully crafted coursework and real-world case studies. This program isn't just about learning law, Jordan continued, moving away from the podium to connect more directly with his audience. It's about understanding the communities you'll serve. He gestured to the row of successful attorneys seated behind him, all graduates from underrepresented backgrounds who'd volunteered as mentors. Claire Bennett, working the presentation slides, displayed maps showing the initiative's reach. 50 partner universities across all 50 states, each committed to supporting minority law students through specialized training and hands-on experience. Every one of you will be paired with a practicing attorney, Jordan explained, his face brightening as he watched students lean forward in their seats. They'll guide you through real cases, help you navigate the system, and show you how to effect genuine change. After the presentation, Jordan walked through the crowd, stopping to shake hands and answer questions. Young faces lit up as he approached, each student eager to share their stories and aspirations. He recognized in them the same fire that had driven him all those years ago. In his office later that evening, Jordan reviewed the day's launch events across the country. Video feeds showed similar scenes playing out in law schools from Miami to Seattle, each location packed with students ready to carry the torch of justice reform forward. The walls of his office told the story of his journey, from newspaper clippings about the Harbour case to photos of successful reforms and community celebrations. But it was the newest addition that caught his eye. a map showing hundreds of pins representing future lawyers in the program. Jordan leaned back in his chair, running his hand over the smooth surface of his desk. The weight of what they'd begun settled over him. Each pin on that map represented not just a student, but a community that would benefit from having an advocate who understood their struggles. Looking at the stack of applications still waiting to be processed, Jordan felt the familiar mix of determination and responsibility that had driven him throughout his career. Despite all they'd accomplished, he knew his work was just beginning. The evening sun cast long shadows across Jordan Carter's front porch as he sat beside his mother Evelyn in matching rocking chairs. The gentle creaking of wood against wood created a soothing rhythm as they watched the neighborhood children playing across the street. "Remember when you used to play right there?" she asked, pointing to the sidewalk where young kids were drawing with chalk. "You'd spend hours writing out pretend court cases with your friends." Jordan chuckled, the memory vivid in his mind. "And you'd be my star witness every time." "You always knew exactly what you wanted to be," Evelyn said, her voice filled with pride. "Even when things got hard, you never gave up." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine from Evelyn's carefully tended garden. "I saw on the news today," Evelyn continued, "that 3 more states have adopted your reform programs. And those mentorship initiatives," she shook her head in amazement, "all those young people getting the chance you had to fight for." Jordan thought about the thousands of students now enrolled in his program, each one carrying the potential to create lasting change in their communities. He remembered the determination in their eyes, the same fire he'd once had. "You know," Evelyn said, adjusting the cushion behind her back, "your father would have been so proud." Her voice softened with emotion. "He always said our boy would do great things." "You've changed the world, son," Evelyn said, her voice full of quiet conviction. Jordan looked at his mother, the woman who had shown him what real courage looked like, who had taught him that justice wasn't just about winning cases, but about lifting others up. "We've only just started," Jordan replied. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Gerald Harbor approached the podium. His prison-issued clothes had been replaced by a simple gray suit that hung loose on his thinner frame. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of anger and regret. The crowd fell silent. Many remembered Harbor from the news, the disgraced officer who had tried to destroy Jordan Carter's life. Some shifted uncomfortably in their metal folding chairs, while others crossed their arms, skeptical of what this man could possibly say to make things right. Harbor cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. 10 years ago, he began, his voice rougher than it used to be. I stood in a courtroom, consumed by hatred. I blamed one man for the consequences of my own actions. His eyes scanned the room, briefly catching sight of Jordan in the back row. Prison gives you a lot of time to think, Harbor continued. At first, I used that time to feed my anger. But slowly, I began to see things differently. He paused, taking a shaky breath. I saw how my prejudice had poisoned everything it touched. My career, my family, my soul. The silence in the room deepened as Harbor's shoulders slumped. I lost my wife, my son. Charlie graduated high school without me there. Laura remarried. His voice cracked slightly. I missed it all because I couldn't let go of my hate. He straightened his shoulders, his voice growing stronger. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because I need to acknowledge my wrongs. Not just to Mr. Carter, but to every person I've hurt with my actions and attitudes. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the podium tighter. I can't undo what I've done, but I can pledge to do better, to be better, to use whatever time I have left to help heal the wounds I've created." The room remained quiet, but the tension had shifted. Where there had been skepticism, now there was a cautious hope. Harbor's raw honesty had touched something in the audience. "Mr. Carter," Harbor said, looking directly at Jordan now, "you showed me something I didn't understand before. True justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration, about making things right." He paused, swallowing hard. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I promise to spend every day trying to earn it." In the back of the room, Jordan sat perfectly still, his expression thoughtful. He studied the man before him, not the bitter, vengeful officer from a decade ago, but someone different, someone who had finally faced his demons and chosen to change. As Harbor finished speaking and stepped away from the podium, Jordan gave a single, quiet nod of approval. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement, recognition of the difficult journey from hatred to hope. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the freshly painted walls of the Robert Carter Community Center. Jordan stood before the gathered crowd, his hand resting on the bronze plaque that bore his father's name. The building, once an abandoned warehouse in their old neighborhood, now gleamed with promise and purpose. Jordan adjusted his tie, remembering how his father had taught him to tie one for his first school debate. Robert Carter hadn't been a lawyer or a community leader. He'd worked 2 jobs as a janitor and night security guard. But he'd taught Jordan something more valuable than any legal precedent: dignity in the face of injustice. "My father," Jordan began, his voice carrying across the hushed audience, "worked in buildings like this one. He cleaned floors, fixed broken windows, and kept watch through long nights. But he never saw it as just a job. He saw it as service to his community. Dad used to tell me, 'Son, a building is just walls and windows until people give it purpose.'" Jordan gestured to the renovated space behind him. "This center will house after-school programs, legal aid clinics, job training workshops, and community meetings. It will be what my father always dreamed of, a place where people could find help, hope, and a path forward." Jordan's voice softened with emotion. "He didn't live to see me become a lawyer or fight the battles we've won. But everything I've accomplished started with the lessons he taught me on that porch." The center's doors were decorated with colorful welcome banners made by local children. Inside, new computers lined the walls of the learning lab, and the community meeting room was set up with comfortable chairs, a far cry from the metal folding chairs of Jordan's youth. "This center," Jordan continued, "isn't just about providing services. It's about creating a space where dignity is the foundation, where every person who walks through these doors knows they deserve respect and opportunity." As Jordan prepared to cut the ribbon, Evelyn rose from her seat and joined him. Her eyes glistened as she took in the building that would carry her husband's name. She reached for Jordan's hand, just as she had done countless times when he was a boy. "Your father would be proud," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of struggle and triumph. Jordan's electric car hummed quietly as he navigated the familiar streets of his city. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden hues, and he couldn't help but notice how different things felt from just a few years ago. On the corner of Malcolm X Boulevard, Officer Sarah Chen was helping a group of kids practice basketball moves. The children's laughter mixed with the rhythmic bounce of the ball, creating a soundtrack that would have been unimaginable before the reforms. Jordan slowed down as he passed Memorial Park, where Officer Marcus Reed was leading a community safety workshop. Residents and police officers sat together on picnic blankets, engaged in animated discussion. Some were taking notes, others nodding in agreement. The tension that used to define these interactions had been replaced by genuine collaboration. Near the community garden, Jordan spotted Officer James Thompson helping an elderly woman carry her groceries. It wasn't part of any official program, just a simple act of kindness that had become increasingly common. The woman's warm smile spoke volumes about the changing relationship between law enforcement and the community. As he drove through the business district, Jordan noticed a group of officers walking their beat, stopping to chat with shop owners. They knew people by name now, asked about their families, shared jokes. The U.S. versus them mentality had given way to a sense of shared purpose. Outside the youth center, a police community basketball game was in full swing. Officers and teenagers played together, their competitive spirit tempered by mutual respect. Parents watched from the sidelines, cheering for both sides. Jordan remembered when such scenes existed only in his imagination. He passed the police academy, where the new training facility displayed its motto, "Protect, Serve, Unite." Through the windows, he could see recruits attending cultural sensitivity training led by community members. The curriculum he'd helped develop was changing the very foundation of law enforcement. At a busy intersection, Jordan watched as Officer Maria Rodriguez handled a minor fender bender. Instead of the tense exchanges he'd witnessed countless times before, she mediated with patience and empathy, helping both drivers reach an understanding. The changes weren't just visible in individual interactions. Crime rates had dropped. Complaint filings against officers had plummeted. Community satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented levels of trust. The statistics backed up what Jordan could see with his own eyes. Real, meaningful change was possible. He drove past the courthouse where his journey had begun. The building looked the same, but everything it represented had transformed. Justice wasn't just about punishment anymore. It was about restoration, understanding, and growth. Jordan found a quiet spot overlooking the city. He parked his car and stepped out into the evening air. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the cityscape below. "This is what justice looks like," he said, a smile spreading across his face. If you enjoyed the story of Jordan Carter, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.